Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Walter Russell Mead. Walter Russell Mead is the Ravenel Curry III Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute, and he's James Clarke Chace Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College, and I guess we've all seen him and read him. He's the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. Not an ordinary view or a national view or any kind of parochial view, but the global view. And he's been a fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and the Henry Kissinger Senior Fellow. That's what he was when he was there. And he's a member of the Aspen Institute. He's got books published by that most elegant and distinguished publisher, Knopf, Alfred Knopf. One is Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, and the other, God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World. He's a graduate of Groton and of Yale. Did you get your PhD from there?
No, I have only a BA in English literature.
Wonderful.
So I'm a complete fraud.
I'm very pleased to hear that. So, anyway, so this is Walter Russell Mead, and he's going to talk about the information economy and global balance. Turbulence. Balance in the mess of turbulence.
Great. Well, thank you.
Great to have you here. Yeah.
Thanks for that introduction. It's always fun to sit and listen to somebody read the august stream of syllables of my titles. Thank you for that. Boosts the ego a little bit, maybe. I wanted to talk today about what I think is one of the most interesting, puzzling, and in some ways alarming paradoxes that I see as I look at both the world as it is and at the great and the good of the United States, our foreign policy establishment, the commentariat, my friends and colleagues in many cases. Because it seems to me that right now we have a situation in which the foreign policy conventional wisdom is firmly grounded on two contradictory propositions. One is that everything is changing. The information revolution is as big as the industrial revolution, if not bigger. The economy is being disrupted. Our societies are being disrupted. And we can just expect more of this the further we look ahead. But then on the other hand, there is an equally firm, though often unstated and unreasoned, belief that nothing important will change. That is, NATO is going to go on being NATO. The OSCE will continue to function much as before. The American people are going to remain committed to this world order project dating back to the Second World War and then sort of updated at the end of the Cold War. So that the European Union will continue to grow larger and grow deeper. The world as a whole will continue moving inexorably toward the kind of global Brussels in the end. We're all on the long march to Brussels. Some of us are ahead of others, but the direction of history is known, and it's toward a kind of liberal multilateralism that reflects the sort of, the aspirations of European liberalism and American liberalism of the last 50 years. So everything is changing, and yet nothing will change. This is an unstable set of beliefs, and in my view, in fact, the fundamental elements of world order that we have taken for granted for so long, and which have performed reasonably well for an extraordinary period of time, are far more vulnerable than people think. And I find the sort of ability of our foreign policy leadership, I don't refer to political appointees of the current administration who have a different set of issues, but the sort of the Council on Foreign Relations, the career officials in the State Department, and so on and so forth, that this is just a stunning demonstration of the vacuity of the most august conventional wisdom, and that some of the best and smartest and best qualified people in our society are embarked like Captain Ahab on a quest that will not end well for them or anybody else. And the question for me when I look at this is not why do people think everything is changing, because I do think that's kind of obvious in some ways. I mean, Peter Thiel is arguing that the rate of technological change may in fact be slowing, but even if that's true, the filtering out of the consequences of technology that's already been developed into our society is going to continue to disrupt and overwhelm all kinds of traditional industries, institutions. And when we look at the sort of magnitude of changes that have already occurred but whose political consequences are still being worked out, for example, the essential collapse of the industrial working class in the developed West, a major historical change and few people really expected that capitalism would outlast the industrial working class, but in fact it did. It has. This is going to change the way politics works in ways that, again, we are just beginning to experience. So I'm not surprised that people think a lot of things are changing. What I do find interesting and worth interrogating is the strength of this belief that nothing important will change, that somehow the practices, the institutions, the ideas that underlie American foreign policy for the last 70 years are largely immune to the upheaval taking place in so much of the rest of the world. And that's I'd like to explore some of that with you today, and I'll be very interested to get some feedback and some comments on this. And I should say in the first place, I don't think this is necessarily a good news story. I am as convinced as anybody is that the good decisions taken after World War II and some of the very wise choices that were made then have helped to ensure 2 generations of great power peace, or at least avoided nuclear war, and that in an ideal world we would be building on those achievements rather than wondering whether even their foundations are going to endure. But it seems to me if you're not prepared to look at the real issues and the real difficulties, you certainly should not be engaged in the field of foreign affairs. So why are people so convinced that the framework of international life is immune to this historical storm that we begin to see? And I think that a lot of it there are 3 reasons, and I think the first one has a lot to do with the sense that after World War II and after the absolutely horrendous first half century of the 20th century, that we had learned something. At the deepest level, I think humanity had found a way to manage the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Because when the Industrial Revolution begins to sweep in the 19th century, some pedants will argue with me the late 18th century, who cares really? But for those times, the rules changed. The rules of banking and finance changed. Urbanization changed the way society worked. Politics changed. And people had to improvise because very often no one knew what to do about these new problems. Suddenly you have massive urban unemployment without a welfare state, without really the administrative capacity to have a welfare state even if you wanted one. And you didn't understand why there was the financial crash in the first place, and you had no idea what to do with the urban unemployment. And in fact, you were shocked that unlike their fathers, they couldn't just go back to the countryside and live with relatives. So politics had to adjust to these new phenomena And it took new ideas, new institutions, new ways of thinking. I think the United States between 1865 and 1900 was really in the position of having an economy that was careening forward, and political ideologies, governmental institutions, that were absolutely unable to comprehend, much less counteract, the problems that society was facing. Well, that after 1945, people began to feel we'd gotten a handle on that. Okay, macroeconomic policy can prevent new depressions. Bank regulation can prevent the kinds of financial crashes. You could have a moderate welfare state. You could have a regulated national economy. Essentially, you could offer, largely speaking, lifetime employment to many people. Get a job at AT&T, our one and only phone company, and you would never get fired. You could not hardly be fired. Almost every jobs were more and more like the post office, where getting fired was extremely difficult, almost like tenure. And the idea was that standards of living could rise a couple of percent every year. The next generation would have a visibly higher living standard than their parents. A generation that started out as hardscrabble immigrants or sharecroppers, their kids could go to school and do better. It was the best of all possible worlds. And it was pretty good. It was a great improvement, certainly, on what we had before. This meant a deep social peace began to come over the West. Yes, we had lots of disruptions and arguments. We're human beings. But there was no more politics, real politics of revolution. We had organized political parties that had mass support, who wanted fundamental changes in the way society worked. John Kenneth Galbraith talked about the end of ideology. There was certainly a narrowing of ideological extremes. And out of the sort of domestic political stability that by and large marked the countries of Western Europe, Japan, United States, Canada, after World War II, and to a much deeper extent ever than before, the international arrangements and patterns of this time were grounded in that social consensus. And it was an era of stability and peace in the Western world, of calm that had rarely been known before. The expectation, then there was a sense that the Cold War was the unfinished business. And the Cold War was seen as kind of a competition between liberal capitalism and communism to see who could best master the Industrial Revolution and deliver its benefits to the people. And the sense in 1990 was that, okay, it was a fair competition, capitalism won. And so there's a sense that this system, this post-World War II system of moderate politics, social peace, etc., was now, had really demonstrated its longevity, its superiority. There was no ideological competition to it. History was over, and there we were. And on that basis, one can talk about a very stable international set of relationships. You're not going to have an election that takes a country on a fundamentally different political path. So you can have an alliance like NATO, which has no provision for the expulsion of members, and which thinks of it, constitutes itself as a permanent organization, and that international relations can be more and more mediated through institutions operating according to clear rules, all of these kinds of wonderful things that, again, the European Union in some ways is the high point that we've reached so far as a species in these forms of cooperation. So liberal internationalism was no longer a kind of theoretical horizon, that there was this Kantian perpetual peace that someday humanity might be reaching. It was not only a political program, but it was a political program well on the way towards success. And that conviction, I think, people have lived in this world for 2 generations, and the conviction that history is moving in this direction has moved, it's just become sort of a background assumption that one doesn't really question, one doesn't really think about, one operates within this context. And I think that's true of a lot of our foreign policy people. Strengthening this conviction, I think, in ways that were really rather overt at the beginning, but over the last couple of generations faded into the background a bit, is the idea that the alternative to this kind of stable, permanent, expanding and deepening world order is simply unthinkable, because it's a return to the kind of international anarchy and chaos that marked international relations in the past, and particularly, for example, in the first half of the 20th century, and a return to that kind of international competition when there are nuclear weapons and more of them all the time and proliferating all the time is a recipe for human destruction. And there's a real apocalyptic zeal. There was, those of you who either lived through these years or have studied them will know that American foreign policy discussions in the 1940s and 1950s were filled with discussions of how, if we don't build these new systems, if we don't prevent the next world war by treating the causes of world war and so on, then we will be stuck in this world. And the consequences now, if we look at how World War I was worse than anybody had ever seen before, and World War II was worse than that, let's just project forward into World War III. We probably don't need to think too hard about World War IV. So there's a very strong need to believe that we have left that behind, that chaos of that. That's the old days, and we are now in a new historical era where things are good. And finally, I would say, the third element here that is worth thinking about is that this post-industrial society, or not post-industrial, but kind of post-conflictual, mature industrial society of the last 70 years was the paradise, the golden age of the wonk, of the policy wonk, of the technocrat. Because, once we say that we understand the economy and we understand basically the way our society works. And so the technocrat, the wonk, is the person who knows what the right policies are. And the administrative class of managers, intellectuals, journalists, all of these people sort of operate between the plutocrats who, if they pursue their own greed, their follies would lead us to destruction and class conflict like we saw in the past, and then the kind of stupid but lovable workers who, without the guidance of an intellectual elite who really know how things work, would also go, fall for populism and all kinds of, quack medicine. And so we are the ones. It's our job to keep humanity on this even keel. It's the job of the foreign policy establishment to manage this complex web of relationships that the post-war World War II world order entails. And fundamentally to save humanity from itself, because we've got the skills and the knowledge to do that. And I think the reality, as far as I can tell, is that the mature industrial society turned out not to be the final stage of human social evolution. that the information revolution is disrupting the relationships, the politics, whether you think in terms of political economy, you think in terms of culture, you think in terms of international relations, we're back in the melting pot again in a unpredictable, unknown kind of way, where that it turns out that period of calm, say from 1950 to 2010, or however you want to define it, was not the end of history. It was more like the eye of the storm. And that what we're now beginning to feel are the winds of the back end of the storm as we leave the eye and move back into this unknown and rather dangerous future. So collapse of the industrial working class, the collapse of consensual politics, the fact that it's most important to understand the technocrats no longer have a lot of the answers. So you ask someone from the federal, you ask any economist, so how come we've got $14 trillion of negative debt at a time, or whatever the number is, at a time of fiscal stimulus, in the U.S. that we've never seen before, and there's like no inflation. There's no you can't find an economics textbook written, say, before 2010 that even entertains such a possibility. And we don't really have answers to the questions of how do you guarantee the smooth functioning of the national economy or the world economy under contemporary conditions. And this is, unfortunately, this has been perceived by a lot of ordinary people who have lost, the foreign policy elites told us in 1990, let's have free trade with China. It will make everyone in America rich, and it will make China peaceful and democratic. I'm overstating a bit, but not actually that much. All right? It's clearly stupid nonsense. It's wrong. It's profoundly, deeply wrong. All right? And so people no longer believe what the experts tell them. The experts still are acting on the kind of inertia of the social prestige and the self-confidence, I think, that came from a time when they had better answers. But what's changed is the nature of our society. The nature of our knowledge has not kept up with it. So we are, I think we are facing a period where we're going to see, as we see in a very mild way in Great Britain today, that populist resentment of what technocrats are absolutely convinced is the right way to go can disrupt international institutions, international society. In a more profound way, we've seen it with what's happened under Erdogan in Turkey, where a NATO ally has moved into a very, very different relationship. We can see that India has absolutely no interest into the sort of Hindutva age of trying to create a global liberal society in the Western image. Obviously, China has its own vision and plans for the world. The world is not going where we thought it was going. And unfortunately, I would say, first of all, that is a bit dangerous in itself, because the way we thought and hoped the world was going was, seemed like a fairly benign one. But it's dangerous because I think we're still unable to wrap our heads around the dramatic change in the direction of world events. And until we do that, they will be more disruptive and more dangerous than they have to be. And we will also be less effective than we need to be at thinking of what policies, what approaches, both at home and abroad, are best calculated to thrive and flourish in new and, in some ways, more difficult conditions. So that's just a quick overview of what I've been thinking about.
Thanks very much, Walter. So where are we going? Peter.
I like your phrase, rather than the end of history, we find we were in the eye of the storm. The conditions are usually going to be storm, as an exception, as that suggests. People seem to always think that conditions they've been working under, are likely to endure, and when change comes, there's always a lot of slowness to believe that some fundamental changes happen. So, if the question is, why are people, elites, slow to believe this now, in a way, that would also seem to just be human nature. If the question is, what comes next? Do you have any thoughts on that, or what? Obviously, nobody knows, but what sort of thing might come next? What sort of structures might work there?
Well, first of all, just to your first point, I'd say, yes, it's true, it's human nature to, and it's also wise and prudent not to be the first one to go, oh my goodness, the sky is falling. And we have a lot of people, we have a lot of Chicken Littles running around too, that's part of human nature. So yes, you don't at the first sign of trouble, but I think there's also a question of degree, and the change, things like the Industrial Revolution, the Information Revolution, are far more profound than the sort of scale of change human beings have been used to through most of their existence. So I think it's a bigger problem. Well, I would say that I think that when I think about what's coming, fundamentally I'm an optimist, at least in the sense that I believe the potential is there for this to really be, fantastic. That what we are essentially talking about greater human ability to create value out of nature, and I think a lot of the remaining problems of the industrial age, like for example carbon emissions, the information revolution is likely to supply answers to a lot of things that now look to us close to insoluble. I think it is, again, the Industrial Revolution, when it came, it was a cornucopia of wealth pouring out on people, but the consequences were incredibly destructive. And the spinners and the weavers of Lancashire didn't think this is a cornucopia of wealth opening out. So it's going to be a mixed period, no matter what. I think in some ways the people who will be at great risk in this are exactly people like us, that is to say the wonks, because I think the algorithm replaces the wonk, the policy wonk, as well as the steam loom replaces the Lancashire spinner. And that the sort of middle management, technocratic, bureaucratic, how large will the Labor Department be in 25 years? Probably politically larger than it needs to be. But in fact, there are government has not yet seen the kind of massive reductions in clerical employment that the private sector has seen. So there's going to be a lot going on. And I think in some ways both our health systems and our higher education systems are economically unsustainable the way they're set up, and things will have to change. The information revolution is going to have to unsettle us in some ways. But clearly we don't yet really have, what we have right now are two kinds of nostalgia, it seems to me, in politics. We have let's say, Elizabeth Warren nostalgia, which is, the good old days can come back. It's just a bunch of bad technocrats allied to greedy oligarchs made some bad policy decisions. And if we just turn the dial back to the right space, maybe a few adjustments for technology, it can be 1958 again, but at a higher level of prosperity. We can all have the jobs, the kinds of jobs that AT&T used to give people when it was a monopoly, without having to have the kind of crappy phones and phone service that you used to get when AT&T was a monopoly. I don't think that's possible. But that is the narrative that a lot of Americans are working on right now, and not just in the U.S. That the old utopia was stolen from us by the uber rich, and we can get it back. By contrast, what you hear a lot of on the Republican side right now is deeply confused because of the presence of the Trump volcano in the Trump disruption in the middle of the Republican Party. But there's still a sense that somehow if we could get, if we could get back to Calvin Coolidge, that all of this just proves the New Deal didn't work at all. And if we can get back to the jurisprudence of the 1920s and to the economic policies of the 1920s, we can all just flourish. My sense is that that's probably, society does get more complex and need more complex institutions and adjustments and even interventions. So I don't think we need the narrative. We need some forward-looking narratives.
You just mentioned the climate, but so you didn't totally ignore it, but it wasn't the focus of your remarks, as it would have been, as would have been the case with many others, who also would say we face a crisis
Right.
of new events and so on, and then so what are they wrong, or I mean, what do you think? Let's talk about the climate then, a little bit. Sustainability,
Okay.
things like that.
Well, in some ways, let me just open the conversation by saying I'm the wrong person to ask about this because I don't know anything about
Yeah.
the climate science and so on. I'm just one of these people that sort of.
I'm the same position, but and that's why I asked.
But it doesn't, this is also my Twitter handle. I say there that opinions are like love. The more you give away, the more you have. And so I have no shortage of opinions here. And basically what I think is that, as far as I can tell in my nearsighted, muddled way, global temperatures do seem to be rising. There does seem to be a reasonable case to be made that human activity plays a part in this. I don't sort of go full hog, and therefore the science is settled and so on, in part because I've just lived through enough cases where settled science. Dinosaurs today are not at all the same animals they were when I was a kid. They're much friskier, they have brighter colors, and I must say the female dinosaurs have a bigger social role than when I was a kid. And on the other hand, by the way, outer space has changed. There were no computers in outer space when I was a kid. So settled science I don't know about. But, okay, so let's proceed on the assumption that actually carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions are causing a problem, that the problem is more likely than not to get worse over time and to have significant economic and social consequences. Let's take that as a basis for discussion. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that this movement, the climate movement, will not solve that problem. That there is no better funded civil society, no more globally organized, and no more politically successful movement in the world than the contemporary climate movement. And it has utterly failed to affect the curve of carbon emissions in a significant way. And, the climate treaty in Paris is a joke. It's the Kellogg-Briand treaty of today.
Explain the climate treaty, please.
What? The climate treaty?
Yeah.
Well, a non-binding agreement by...
Treaty.
Treaty, yes.
I heard trees, sorry.
Sorry, treaty. Right, the Paris Climate Accords. You read what prominent Greens say about them, and that say these commitments, even if they were kept, will not do what needs to be done, and also they're not being kept. And Western Europe can recycle and everything else as much as it wants, but unless China and India, follow suit, it won't matter. And there are a lot of reasons why I think that's true, why this is so ineffective. Some of them have to do with, just how hard the problem actually is. Some of them also have to do with the stupidities and the anti-scientific bias of so many people in the climate movement. So, for example, what is the best, most efficient use of solar power? It is not panels on a rooftop, though I have nothing against panels on rooftops. It is a field of genetically modified soybeans that don't need fertilizer or pesticide. Okay? But basically, the climate movement in Europe would rather see the earth perish in flames than have a bottle of genetically modified soy milk on sale in a grocery store in Belgium. All right? What is the most effective, low, zero emissions method to generate electricity? It's nuclear. Again, where does the heart of opposition to nuclear power come from? From the climate movement. Not universally, but overwhelmingly. People have not, it seems to me, looked enough at the way that if you just think about the economics of this thing, the amount of money that you would get if you were in the business of producing renewables and renewable energy and own some patents is so immense. If you can basically engineer the world onto a renewable path, we're talking about trillions of dollars. All right, and a lot of the money that flows into the climate movement comes from people who have a very solid economic stake in in boosting renewables. Now, in itself, there's nothing immoral about people who would benefit from certain government policy organizing to try to get those favorable policies adopted. This is the First Amendment. This is, it's all of that. But if you think about the influence of renewables money on the policy choices and menus of climate organizations, the way funding works in these kinds of situations, and also I think the absence of a skeptical press about the climate movement, that the press sort of doesn't give, if somebody it doesn't ask the same questions about a pro-green movement. Where does its funding come? Does the agenda of the donors shape what it does? And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it's a piece of information. And I do think that the climate movement's addiction to the renewables path, and I would not disagree that they are part of a solution, but if we're sort of going to put ourselves in the position that really has to be it, then I think where we get ourselves is the only way to get only prayer you have of getting public opinion to support this is by scare tactics and so on, and it's not going to happen. I don't think it works. And so I perceive the climate movement as something of a dead end. And I would say that estimation is one that's shared by many of the movement's sort of most committed leaders.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
The speaker, Mr. Mead, you seem to say that the media is biased towards the pro-green movement. Is there a reason for that, based on your analysis?
I think the media generally reflects the opinions of basically the educated upper middle class pretty well. And, that you call it bias if you disagree with the upper middle class standard position on something, and you call it intelligent and forward-looking if you agree. But I do think, I would say it's not, yes, there is a certain amount of anything you put green lipstick on any pig, and people say that's not a pig, that's a beautiful environmental thing. Ethanol was an early example of this, of a big pig with some green lipstick on it that was uncritically hailed as an answer, and now that it's entrenched and almost impossible to get rid of, is now perceived more accurately as a disaster. And so I think it would have been better had the press taken a more skeptical look at the ethanol advocates at the beginning. And I think there are other elements of the climate. I think everything, including my claims, benefits from skeptical public discussion and back and forth. And I think because all sensible people want want climate change not to reach some sort of disastrous level, that sometimes the claims are not as scrutinized as carefully and skeptically as they ought to be. And in my perception, that's not being biased against something to question it skeptically. That's just playing an important role in an ongoing public debate.
No one can disagree with your statement that all issues should be thoroughly examined and debated, but I am deeply troubled by your comparison to the erroneous reception of the of ethanol as our salvation on this matter with renewables. I can't see that.
Well, ethanols are a form of renewables, and that was actually and it was a case of something that could be made to look green. And there were powerful economic interests that wanted that technology to go forward. And there wasn't enough, I think, at the time debate, really what will the effects of this be? There was more like, hey, it's a foot in the door, it's a step in the right direction. And so, so ethanol was not attacked as a bogus boondoggle from the start. It was seen as, at last we're starting, and it was a progressive idea at the beginning.
Okay, I accept that. I didn't know as much about ethanol as I should, but what are renewables? Solar, wind, and hydropower? I can't see.
Well, nuclear arguably is renewable too.
But nuclear has tremendous storage problems. It has other effects.
Hydro, of the ones you've mentioned, hydro plays the largest role, and it's the one that the Greens hate the most because it involves damming rivers and disrupting ecosystems. And so try to get a big dam built today. Think of the environmental response to the Three Gorges Dam in China. It was a huge issue, and people tried to get the World Bank not to fund it and so on. And the dams that are being proposed for the Mekong Delta or for the Mekong River. And again, they will have tremendous environmental costs. But my point is that the environmental movement tends, you could say it has an instinct for the capillary. That the sources of power that it likes most are the hardest and most expensive to actually use in the ways they would need to be used if you were going to make the whole economy run on them.
Isn't wind and solar what the climate change movement, whatever it is, focuses on most?
But remember that you have to basically, there are all kinds of problems with them, and a lot of them are related to intermittency. That you still need power when it's dark. And in the northern hemisphere, when you get the least sun is when you need the most power because it's cold. And the storage, basically apparently, and again, I'm no expert on this, so I'm way out of my comfort zone here. But as I understand it, you've got to actually build fossil fuel. The more renewables you need, the more fossil plants you need to supply when the renewables aren't working.
I doubt that.
This has been happening. And if you also look at, the sort of insanities of some, Germany banning nuclear. Japan, it might make some sense to ban nuclear because Japan is on a lot of earthquake faults. Germany is one of the best places in the world for nuclear power. And German engineering is about as good as it gets. So that Germany has gotten rid of nuclear power strikes me as extremely destructive. And in fact, in many cases, they're burning more coal to replace the nuclear. So, it's, and ultimately, again, you come down to this problem of how do you get China and India and other developing countries not to increase their emissions. And I'm afraid that renewables won't do that. that when people talk, for example, about electric cars, in China, they will burn coal to get the electricity.
Did you read Al Gore's article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago? You must have. and
I've gotten
it
tired
gives a
of
different
Al Gore.
picture.
Al Gore
on
gives
this.
very different pictures. I don't find him credible anymore. That's just I saw his last movie, which was probably a mistake, but after that, I'm kind of done with it. It was terrible. Go watch the movie and you'll see what I mean.
I've shown it.
Well, the second movie, how he saved
The
climate
sequel.
change single-handedly by getting India to agree. Nobody outside of him confirms that story.
Yeah, just to push back a little on this idea of post-World War II to 2010 being this era of happy, rule-based international order. I mean, what about Vietnam? What about the Iranian hostage crisis? What about all those people in the Gulag in the Soviet Union and the fear of nuclear conflagration? I mean, I actually think if you look at that period compared to now, I don't think now is that much more dramatically chaotic or scary or disordered.
Well, these things are always at some point a matter of opinion, but I lived through those days, and I certainly remember the Cuba Missile Crisis when we actually did go through nuclear drills in my school, 5th grade, I think then. And that certainly when John Kennedy spoke in his inaugural about the hard, bitter peace. Yeah, people did not feel the Cold War was a holiday, but very few people doubted that it was better than what was happening before, from 1914 to 1945. And there was also a sense of an upward momentum. But the sense that, we weren't going to have another depression. Because you think about how things looked in 1948, where you'd had World War I, then, a few slightly good years in Europe, but basically a lot of trouble leading into the Great Depression. Stalin going on his rampages. Then you have World War II. There was this sense of a downward descent. And then I think there was a sense, yes, it's dangerous. Yes, we've got the communists are out there and they're a huge problem. But even by the 1980s, the communists seemed to be a bit in the rearview mirror. Once Western Europe stabilized, and once it was clear that Western Europe and Japan were going to be okay, and that the American economy was moving forward. Yeah, there was the Vietnam War, but it was perceived as, not the same kind of exit. In fact, one of the reasons the Vietnam War was as bitter politically here was that we had 500,000 people there, but increasingly it was hard to see why, for what stake. Or you wouldn't have asked what was the stake of World War II. So I think that, yes, no one ever thinks I am living in the calmest time ever. Just like everybody in this room is the oldest you've ever been. And so, all of us, whether we are 18 or whether we are 90, are at some point during the day are likely to have reflection, I am getting so old. Or, oh, I used to be so young. And so, this is a factor. But I think what we're seeing now is, the process of building and construction that was taking place in those days has turned to one of disaggregation. And a sense of declining ability to determine the outcome of events. I think that China is likely to be a geopolitical problem that is more concerning than the Soviet Union by the time it's done. Although there are a lot of uncertainties about that forecast too.
Andy and then Ross. Andy,
Follow
go.
up on the last question and your comment, for example, about interest rates. It seems to me, thinking back to the late 1960s, comparing it today, that we don't have, as you said, a kind of fear of World War III present in our national consciousness. So we seem to be living in a world, in many ways, without consequences, without having to pay high interest rate for our debts, without obviously being in the midst of a foreign policy crisis, though many are looming. What do you think accounts for the complacency and the anxiety, and what is the relationship, in your view, between our national politics and how regular people in civil society are going about their lives in 2019?
Okay. I think, there again, the sense of, I started the talk talking about the mix between a complacency and a concern. The concern that everything is changing, the complacency that nothing will change. And I was putting that I was speaking of that in terms of the foreign policy establishment, because those are folks I spend a fair amount of time with. But I think that is also true in other establishments. I think that's true in many ways. It's not just elites who thought that the last 60 years were a pretty good time in history. And so there are people in business, who have gotten used to operating in a world where globalization was just becoming more established every year, and political risk was dropping and becoming more manageable every year. And so different people are, on different wavelengths and, with different experiences, are kind of waking up, are rebalancing complacency and concern as time goes by. And yes, if you're an average consumer right this minute, maybe you're reading in the newspaper or on Facebook or wherever you're getting your news that there are some storm signals ahead for the economy. But basically your experience is, since 2008, things have been on a rising curve, and that actually, in some ways, the last couple of years, the rise has gotten steeper. So you're feeling good. We'll see what happens. I can't. If I could predict where the economy was going, I wouldn't be sitting here in this room wasting my time talking to you. I would be in my secret fortress, investing. So none of us really know. But I think, yes, if the economy goes down again in some way, if this all kind of cascades into something, we have trouble. I do think we are building problems. I look at pension funds, for example, and the financial stability of pension funds and the ways in which we're likely to see an increasing generational conflict. In cities like Chicago already, it's how much are we spending on our schools this year, and how much are we spending on pensions on people who used to teach but aren't teaching now. And one of the things that does is it drives people out of cities with large debts and into suburbs and other places where the overhead is lower and a higher percentage of their tax money goes to supporting the services that they need. So I see a lot of things moving. If interest rates do go up again, and I suspect at some point they will, federal debt will become a more significant issue. So I think we're a little bit, in many ways, we're still like the coyote in the cartoons that would run off the mesa and be fine until it looked down. To some degree, I think we've still got some of that going on for us.
Ross.
The Paris Accord and Kellogg-Briand had in common a wish for the world. I don't think they had a plan for the world. They both occurred in a world of nation states, and part of the EU's problems today is that they're not sure whether they're still in a world of nation states or not, because they decided not to go ahead with the federation. it seems to me that even less today should we talk about a world plan. One of Mr. Trump's virtues is that he doesn't believe in one, that you can't have one. And if technology has released the individual, and it has even in China, and there's a China of the individual and the internet that's quite unrelated to what President Xi said a couple of days ago. But in a world where the individual is released in different ways, won't world plans become even less relevant?
I tend to, even if we just say that politics inside countries is becoming less predictable, then that means that, international planning and international institutions become less effective. Because you just can't count on Turkey in 5 years being the same kind of country it was 5 years ago, for better or for worse. For the Europeans, I think there is a special problem, which is that as nation states, they're actually too small. Each of them is too small, even Germany, to have the impact on the world that it feels it needs to have. And yet they are so different that when they try to cooperate, they find all kinds of obstacles and difficulties. And it's a tremendously frustrating position to be in. And I don't know whether it's soluble or not, but I tend less to be one of the Americans who shakes their finger at the EU and more sort of wishes them well. But I don't see how they're headed for something. On your core question of plans and Kellogg-Briand, I think that the treaty process can be very effective when it calls for verifiable action on a narrow range of subjects. So some of the earliest extremely successful environmental treaties were things like treaties to protect fur seals. There have been a lot of international treaties and very successful ones to save endangered species and do things for the ocean. I think, I think there's room for stuff like that, and they can be effective. But when you try to, in a sense, channel fundamental decisions about national economic development that affect every industry, every interest in every country, and try to do that through a sort of a treaty mechanism, I think that's a task that machine can't do. So when I think of, how can we start to make better progress on this? I do look at things like, I don't think that 50 years from now, we're going to have the same kind of, like salmon swimming upstream to spawn, commuters flocking into central cities to work and then flocking out at the end of the day. And I think, each generation is better at cooperating and working at a distance. Technology is getting better. I can see a lot more sort of moving toward telework, telecommuting, or more things like these distributed off-site offices, so that you can dramatically reduce transportation emissions. I think we can see in farming enormous potential for GMOs that reduce the need for pesticide, that reduce the need even for irrigation and fertilizer. And when you look at the environmental costs of things like fertilizer and what that does in rivers and so on and so forth, it's enormous. And then you look at the emissions of these heavily energy-intensive and material-intensive industries that support that. It's enormous. And so replacing that kind of energy utilization fundamentally with a few tweaked genes that can be done in a lab, this is extraordinary. I don't know what the jobs of the future will be like. If you had said, you know, in about as late as like 1880, something like 50% of Americans still earned their living from the land. And if you had said to people, okay, in 100 years, 2% of Americans will earn their living from farming, the very natural question would be, you know, what will they do? Where will the jobs be? And people ask those questions. And no one, you know, it was very hard to answer. Now you can imagine somebody would have, I wrote about this in Foreign Affairs at one point, you can imagine that somebody would say, well, gosh, maybe, you know, they're doing all these things with motors, maybe there'll be horseless carriages. And people will have, you know, jobs making horseless carriages, okay? And then, you know, there's all these experiments about flying. Maybe there'll be aerial machines and people, and that's some jobs. But nobody in 1880 would have predicted, for example, that people in the 20th century would make a living in factories that produced baby on board bumper stickers, or produced fuzzy dice that would hang from the window of the horseless carriage. Or that people would make very nice livings writing letters certifying that a certain pet qualified as an emotional support animal to ride on a flying machine with somebody. So, you know, the future really is unknown, which has a lot to, you know, and we can't plan for it in quite the ways people would like. But I do think we can start to think intelligently, at least at the national level, about the kinds of legal and regulatory changes that would encourage the sorts of innovation. And and certainly research and development. You know, these are very important. But it's, you know, one of the hardest things for a technocracy really to process is the unknown. Because for a technocracy, planning is key. I don't know if any of you are engaged in foreign policy, you may have been asked to be involved in these various reviews the Defense Department and the State Department and the CIA, the intelligence community do from time to time about, you know, what will the threats be in 2030, 2040, and they spend a lot of money, they convene a lot of experts, and the Defense Department sort of needs this stuff because, you know, if you're going to want to have a weapon in 2040 or a capability, you do have to kind of start thinking about now how you might get there. But but those forecasts almost never really pan out. The bureaucracy has to have them, but they're not worth very much. And I think so we need to try to begin to unlock our imaginations a little bit, because there's going to be, the future is getting harder to predict. And our bureaucracies, I think, continue to be addicted to prediction in ways that are not very helpful.
First, a comment before, with regard to wind, which is one of the shrines at which the climate movement worships. Those windmills that we see kill literally thousands upon thousands of birds every year. Some of them endangered species, which if you or I shot one of them, we would have a $10,000 fine. In the Obama administration, that industry was given a waiver so that when they kill eagles or condors or whatever, they don't pay any fine. The point being that some of these renewables are not completely clean, and it gets back to the point made about a skeptical press that rarely asks the questions. What I wanted to ask was, my concern about where I see American politics going, especially among the intellectual elite. I see a drive now towards socialism. I think recent surveys have shown that college students now, in majority measure, favor socialism over capitalism, although I doubt they could define either system very well. But the concern I have is that we seem to be moving on a headlong dash, sort of the opposite of complacency, to a system which will increase government power, authority, and regulation, which with dire consequences. It seems only in the intellectual elite is there somehow the failure to see the collapse of the Soviet Union and other communist countries as a message of disapproval of such a system. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, it's very
Let me add one thing. The Democratic Party, the leaders, are in the forefront of this. Not only Bernie Sanders, but most of the presidential aspirants have come out in favor of a hard movement to the left. So.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a concern. I would put it in a context, which is that as I think as the old social model of relatively full employment, relatively stable lifetime employment, defined benefit pension plans, all of that stuff, as that recedes into the past, there is a lot of nostalgia for it, and a lot of anger that it's gone. But what you see if you look at Western democracies as a group, is I think you see a fragmentation of politics where two-party systems are turning into 5- and 6-party systems. There's some reasons why that's harder to happen here. And you're also seeing a movement away from the center, whether it's center-left or center-right. You're seeing a movement toward more radical forms of each of these. And that actually, so I find that troubling. Because if you're getting alternations between, say Lula in Brazil and Bolsonaro, those are quite extreme swings. It's in a country that's doing that, you're unlikely, for one thing, to get any sustained policy of either side, and perhaps not great results. But also you begin to get a lot of people on both sides who thinks that losing an election does not mean you should give up power. And the gradual rise of the consensus, even in Latin America, that democracy would, the benefits of democracy were worth putting up with an occasional government that you did not like. That's weaker now than it was 10 years ago. And that's not a good sign. So I think our drift to the left, or the drift of some Americans to the left, is a concern. But again, if you look at American politics, when you elect Obama and then you elect Trump, I don't care what happens next, you've moved into a different kind of terrain. Obama was not a candidate who could have gotten elected in 1992. Trump was not a candidate who could have gotten elected in 1992. American politics as a whole has moved into, I think, less favorable terrain. And again, the problem with both, the sort of leftist populism, which manifests as socialism, and rightist populism, which manifests as a kind of economically blind nationalism in some ways. Neither one of those is likely to do much for the problems of the real problems of the people who voted for them. And so what you're likely to have is an alternation. You're likely to have two parties, neither one of which is bringing anything helpful to the table. And that tends to lead toward more extremism on both sides in ways that are not good. So I am worried about that, but I see it as one of the signs of this shift away from a period of relative political stability and social calm, relative calm, I say, into something perhaps more dangerous.
Anna.
As for your title of the talk, could you go more into analysis in detail as to how this phenomenon, for instance, that you're describing, connects to the global information revolution? That term to me is still, I'm not very familiar with it actually. I mean, or even a phenomenon like China, or a phenomenon like Turkey, or I don't know, could you give us some case studies and show important stages that were not foreseen in this way, and their implications and consequences?
Well, I'll take, Let me take what I think of is the most consequential so far of the changes associated with the information revolution, and I'll do a comparison with similar things in the Industrial Revolution
Right.
to try to make my point. All right, and we'll start with the Industrial Revolution. And one of the most important early consequences of the Industrial Revolution was a big boom in agriculture. That is, you know, in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, on through the 19th century. First of all, as you get manufacturing, you have more people living in cities not growing their food. They need food. And so growing food by other people to feed them is a good business. But at the same time, the scientific advances associated with the Industrial Revolution are doing things like you have railroads. So in 1820, you could have grown all the wheat in Iowa that you wanted, but it would be very expensive and difficult to get it to London, where people would eat it. By 1870, there are railroads. But also in 1820, you couldn't have plowed the soil in Iowa because the thick connected roots of the sod that had been growing for millennia, you know, regular old plow couldn't do. You needed these new steel plows to cut the sod. So suddenly, territory that had been essentially closed to farming is now open to farming, and you have a huge boom, and farmers, you know, the prairies, people streaming out and having Homestead Act farming is fantastic. Unfortunately for them, however, the same technology was opening up the pampas in Argentina, and it was opening in Ukraine, vast boom of grain and so on. And same thing's going on with sheep and, you know, other products. And after a while, after a big sustained boom in agriculture, you get collapsing prices because there's the rising productivity that the Industrial Revolution has brought to agriculture has created an imbalance of supply and demand. And farmers start going to the wall. Family farms start collapsing. And for 50 years in American politics, right up into the Okies of the Great Depression, you know, the collapse of the family farm was one of the huge driving things going on in American life, and not just here. Okay, so that's a template. In the information revolution, one of the early consequences of the information revolution is to have the same impact on manufacturing. So that in 1950, you could not have had a global supply chain. You know, you couldn't know how many widgets a factory in Malaya had produced on a certain day in a way that would, you couldn't sort of then have your assembly plant in San Diego be ready to do all of this. And manufacturing was largely confined to a few countries that had certain technological and informational capabilities and were linked by certain types of communications. With communication satellites, the development of computers, the kinds of, the information that you need for container shipping to work, all right? You are now able to manufacture in places that couldn't manufacture before. Ginormous boom in global manufacturing, right? And it propels countries like China into the front ranks of world power from marginalization. And it breaks down the global division of labor that during the Cold War a lot of capitalist critics would pounce on as the great reason why capitalism is still a failure. It rests on this global division of labor that condemns the masses of the third world to permanent poverty. So the information revolution generated an industrial surge that changed world politics. As I say, it deindustrialized, well, it destroyed the industrial working class in most of the West. And we've seen the drop in Americans who earn their living in manufacturing since the 1970s as a percentage of the workforce is as precipitous as the drop in agriculture in the late 19th, early 20th century. clerical work, it's having the same effect. So on the one hand, the information revolution contributes to a major shift in the world balance of power. On the other hand, it is destabilizing the political and social aspect in the West. You see what I'm saying? And this is in many ways comparable to what has happened in the Industrial Revolution, only it's happening faster and on a bigger scale.
Yes, Rory.
I wanted to ask you, more, you criticized or you had skepticism for these long-term policy planning boards and other things, but you did offer an idea that China will be middle, long-term, great challenge, maybe greater than the Soviet Union. So I wanted to ask a bit more about that, and just to frame that, you called the policy that seems to have dominated both sides of the foreign policy establishment on China, the hopeful one, globalization through trade, political as well as economic, stupid nonsense. You put your hands up, that was your that was the biggest exclamation of the talk. What explains it? Is it possible that that stupid nonsense position was explained by the fact that it was the self-explanation of the elites in the United States for the victory in the Cold War, that the U.S. or liberal capitalist system is the most powerful and the most politically morally advantageous, and that China is a new, we are not used to this problem. The West is used to outlasting the Soviets or dominating the Nazis because the capitalist machine is stronger and better and more efficient.
You're asking two very complicated questions. One of them is about the future of China, and one of them is about sort of the impact of ideology on Western thinking, liberal ideology on Western thinking. And they're both extremely good questions. I'll try to give something of an answer to both. It's neither one is that easy to answer because they are good. On China, let me, when I sort of was waving my hands, I was partly sort of voicing how the public perceives this. And that could change. I mean, suppose the Hong Kong things spread and there's a color revolution in China. That's not impossible, right? And then we might all 3 years today say, boy, Bob Zellick was a prophet, responsible stakeholder. This could happen. I mean, it's the future and we don't know. But I think, where I think we can legitimately talk about a problem in Western thinking, and it wasn't just confined to elites, though elites, I think, get a big amount of it, was sort of theoryitis. The sort of, the idea that because, one believes, and I'm a liberal Westerner. I believe that, free markets, free governments, free individuals, over time, it's not predestined or anything, but there's a tendency for things to go better. And I like to see that. But it's often, I think, the Western elites are like hikers who see a mountain peak that they want to reach. And they think, great, it's just a straight shot from here. They don't realize the closer you get to that peak, there are valleys, you'll have to make huge detours. What looks like a day hike is actually, a 6-week, incredibly dangerous, treacherous journey. And so it may well be, and I profoundly hope that it is, that ultimately this technological change in China and development will bring about freedom in China, however the Chinese, what they make of that. And there are hopeful signs. But to sort of think that, because you believe that the arc of history bends toward justice or progress, that it's like a streetcar and will come to the stop you want at the time for you to take the ride you need, so that Chinese democratization will solve the problem of Chinese development at just the moment you need it to. Okay, that's when you've gone from practical foreign policy thinking to magical thinking. And what that does, it's when you have, you're so profoundly and thoroughly convinced of a deeply held theory that you fail to perceive how qualified the application of any theory has to be in the world of politics. So I think there's that. Now, just on China, it is, there's never been anything on the scale of what's happened in China in the last 40 years. It's extraordinary, it's amazing, and for all the bad things you can say about China or Chinese foreign policy or whatever you want to say, the fact that hundreds of millions of people are fundamentally living in a better way now than they would have ever thought, anyone would have thought possible in 1980. No human being, I think, can regard that achievement without gratitude, respect, and affection.
Thank you. Dang.
And that really matters. At the same time, the Chinese economy, to me, in my somewhat unsophisticated way, looks like it's got some pretty shaky foundations. Let's just say that in a country where growth hasn't been below 6% in 25 years, even very stupid people making very stupid decisions could make a lot of money. So, when the economy is growing at 10% a year, you can lend a lot of money to your stupidest brother-in-law for his stupidest project, and it will probably come out okay. And that's particularly the case when a lot of the loans are policy loans, and you know that the government has approved of the loans of the decisions that you've made, and so it will spare you bad consequences. Now, when and if that whole thing starts to unravel, and no country has ever grown to fully developed stature without a series of massive financial setbacks and collapses, that system is going to be tested in ways it has not been tested. And the regulators will not have any experience in dealing with this. The party officials will not have any experience dealing with this. Individual business owners will not have had any experience dealing with this. And you can see over the last several years, the Chinese government is well aware that there are some very troubling bubbles in the Chinese economy. A manufacturing bubble, an infrastructure bubble, maybe most profoundly a real estate/housing bubble. And from time to time, they've taken steps to try to, rein these in and stop the processes that are inflating the bubble. As far as I can tell, every time they try this, they have to stop before they really address the problem because the consequences are just too horrendous to contemplate. The stock market starts crashing. And then they realize, that means the collateral that all these banks hold is collapsing, and that means, and get that stock market up again. Or, wait, the real estate market is collapsing, and that means the savings of everybody in Shanghai are in peril, and they're all furious. You just can't do it. So they are trapped in the machine. They are trapped in the machine. They have tried to find a way out. So far, they haven't. I don't know where that goes. I do know that if the best indicators those of us who are not Chinese and aren't immersed in China have is look, the same thing you have with companies in the U.S. If the top executives are selling stock, maybe this is not the time for you to be buying stock in that company. And if you look, what are the kinds of decisions that the Xi Jinping government is making? They are prepare for social unrest, tighten the screws, get the ideology going. This is not what you do if you are serenely confident of what the future is bringing. This is, batten down the hatches. That means you think a storm is coming. In the same way, if we look at what do wealthy Chinese people do, they're trying to get their money out of China. One of the ways, by the way, that they do that is to pay high tuition in the West to universities. Is a very, very good way to, and then even buy an apartment so you can visit. There are lots of, you're getting money out, but in ways that are okay. And then, I talk to a lot of Chinese people. There are a lot of ways of getting money out of China. So, the government is worried about the future, and rich Chinese are also worried about the future. I can't translate that into some kind of forecast. And as they used to say about Wall Street, it climbs a wall of worry. The stock market climbs a wall of worry. So just because people are worrying doesn't mean that something terrible is about to happen. In fact, their worrying may make it less likely. Nevertheless, I think of all the futures for China, the least likely is that it achieves sort of Western per capita income levels without ever going through a massive economic financial shock. I think that's the least likely outcome.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that Obama and Trump would not have been elected in 1992. So my question is, if you compare the democracy or politics in today in America, 2019, versus the democracy in 1992, is it getting worse or getting better? If it's getting worse, how do you make it better?
Well, I think the democracy, in the sense of the system, is working as well as ever, in the sense that people go to the ballot box and they vote. So it's not a question of the political system, it's the question of what state is society in. And there, again, I think deindustrialization, rapid inflation in costs that, things like university education, healthcare, that you really, really need to be part of the middle class and to participate fully in American life. Those costs are going up, incomes are not going up as rapidly. There's a lot of economic insecurity over, a lot more churning employment. You used to have a job with the phone company, that was a job for life. You get a job for Blockbuster Video, and in 10 years, there's no Blockbuster Video anymore. So there's uncertainty there. In addition, I think there are cultural factors, problems over migration, problems over identity politics, whether whatever racial or ethnic groups we're talking about. So a lot of things are stirring the pot. But I would not say this is a problem with democracy. I would say that actually the democratic system is doing what it ought to do, which is to reflect the state of the people. The people, in whatever state of mind they are, go to the polls and make choices. That's what democracy is. And I would still argue we're better off having that system, even when I don't like a particular election outcome, than we are trying to say, well, the people don't really know how to govern themselves, so we wise people need to step in and govern for them.
Last question.
Thanks for your talk. I was curious as to what you thought about the role of social media in hurting or helping democracy.
I think people a little bit exaggerate the role of social media. I've got cousins who are on Facebook. I have two cousins who are brothers. One of them is on Facebook all the time about yay Trump and Hillary should be in jail, and every possible post I get from him. And his brother, every possible post about how horrible Trump is. And I just kind of look at him and say, oh, there's old so-and-so and doing what they do. So I think in some ways we're exaggerating it. I remember reading a lot about, if you go back and you look at when radio was coming in, there was a huge excitement that radio was finally going to democratize things because people could hear directly what their leaders were doing and saying. It would bring enlightenment even to the smallest villages, even illiterate people. Radio was going to be the technology that really made democracy work. Of course, the greatest masters of radio were Hitler and Mussolini. And you know, I think FDR, on the other hand, made a slightly more optimistic case about what radio can do. I think technology turns up the volume on what people were doing anyway, so that it's louder. I don't necessarily know that it's different.
But did it play a role in better targeting supporters in some states? Or do you think it did?
I don't know anybody who has said, you know, I wasn't sure who to vote for, but then I saw this post on Facebook and suddenly I knew. All right? I'm not so sure. I think it may have, you know, it may make people go to the polls who wouldn't otherwise by raising their blood pressure a little bit. But I think that if Hillary Clinton had gone to Wisconsin, that would have made more difference than Facebook not running ads.
Well, thank you so much, Walter. This has been absolutely wonderful.